What would you do if a childhood memory from your happiest days resurfaced in the most unexpected place? For one wealthy woman, a forgotten toy in a homeless shelter unlocks a secret that changes her life forever. Victoria Hale was the epitome of success. At 38, she was one of the top executives in the luxury fashion industry, known for her impeccable style, razor-sharp business acumen, and unshakable confidence. Her sprawling penthouse in Manhattan overlooked the skyline, a testament to the wealth and status she had meticulously built over the years. Yet, behind the glitz and glamour, Victoria carried a profound emptiness she rarely allowed herself to acknowledge. She spent her days in meetings and her nights alone, sipping vintage wine in her opulent living room. Her childhood memories were buried deep beneath the weight of her ambition, locked away like an old chest in the attic of her mind. Meanwhile, in a struggling corner of the city, a humble woman named Carla Bennett worked tirelessly at a homeless shelter. A widow with 2 daughters, Carla had dedicated her life to helping others, despite facing challenges of her own. The shelter was a lifeline for many who passed through its doors, offering not just meals and a place to sleep, but also a sense of hope. Little did Carla know, her unassuming work was about to intersect with a woman from a world she could hardly imagine. Victoria's carefully curated life began to unravel the day her assistant informed her that her company had pledged a sizable donation to the very shelter where Carla worked. The donation was part of a corporate social responsibility campaign, something Victoria typically delegated to her team without much thought. However, this time, a media opportunity required her personal appearance at the shelter. Reluctantly, she agreed, treating the visit as a necessary inconvenience rather than an act of charity. The day she arrived, the shelter was bustling with activity. Volunteers sorted donated clothes while others served steaming plates of food to those in need. The sharp contrast between this environment and the pristine world Victoria inhabited was striking. She felt out of place, her tailored designer suit drawing curious glances from the shelter's patrons. Carla greeted Victoria warmly, guiding her through the shelter with genuine pride. Victoria nodded politely but remained distant, her mind preoccupied with emails and the photo shoot ahead. However, as she passed a table piled high with donated toys, something caught her eye. Nestled among the worn dolls and plastic trucks was a small, faded teddy bear with one button eye missing. Victoria froze. She recognized it instantly. It was her childhood toy. The teddy bear, which she had affectionately named Buttons as a child, was unmistakable. Victoria hadn't seen it in decades, but the memories it stirred were immediate and vivid. She remembered her early years growing up in a modest suburban home, long before wealth or ambition became her life's focus. Buttons had been her constant companion during a time when her family's happiness was whole and life felt simple. But those days had been short-lived. When Victoria was 10, her parents divorced and her once close-knit family splintered apart. Her father disappeared from her life, and her mother, burdened by financial struggles, sold most of their possessions to make ends meet. Buttons had been one of the many things that vanished, leaving Victoria with a sense of loss she had never fully confronted. Standing in the shelter now, holding the worn bear, she was overwhelmed by a wave of emotions she hadn't anticipated. Carla noticed the shift in Victoria's demeanor. "That little bear must have meant something to someone," she remarked, her voice kind but curious. Victoria hesitated, then quickly brushed off the comment, placing the bear back on the table as if distancing herself from its pull. But the encounter had already planted a seed of unease in her heart. Later that evening, Victoria couldn't shake the image of the teddy bear from her mind. It felt absurd to be so affected by an old toy, but Buttons symbolized more than just a piece of her past. It was a relic of a life she had worked so hard to leave behind. She tried distracting herself with work, but memories of her childhood crept in. Her mother's laughter, the warm scent of home-cooked meals, and the safety she had felt in her small but loving home came rushing back. Meanwhile, Carla, unaware of the storm of emotions she had unintentionally triggered, continued her work at the shelter. As she prepared for the next day, she thought about the polished, yet distant woman who had visited earlier. Carla often wondered about the stories of the wealthy donors who supported the shelter. Did they understand the struggles of the people they helped? Did they care beyond the headlines and tax write-offs? Victoria decided she needed answers. Early the next morning, she instructed her assistant to find out how the bear had arrived at the shelter. She learned that it had been part of a donation from a woman who recently moved out of state, leaving behind items she no longer needed. Determined to uncover the full story, Victoria decided to pay another visit to the shelter, this time unannounced. She felt an inexplicable connection to the faded teddy bear, as though it held a key to a part of her life she'd long buried. When she arrived, Carla greeted her with a warm smile, though she couldn't hide her surprise at seeing the wealthy executive return so soon. Victoria carefully explained her interest in the teddy bear. She spoke in a way that was uncharacteristically vulnerable, admitting that the toy had once belonged to her. Carla listened with quiet empathy, then suggested they look through the shelter's records to trace the origin of the donation. Together, they found a logbook with the name of the donor, Helen Murphy. The name meant nothing to Victoria at first, but as she stared at it, a faint memory surfaced. Helen had been a neighbor when she was a child, living just 2 doors down. Helen was the kind woman who often babysat Victoria when her mother worked late shifts. The realization struck her. Helen must have taken the bear when her family moved. With Carla's encouragement, Victoria resolved to contact Helen and find out why the bear had ended up here. While waiting to get in touch with Helen, Victoria found herself drawn back to the shelter more frequently. What started as a mission to solve a personal mystery became an opportunity for reflection. She spent time observing Carla and the volunteers, noticing their tireless dedication despite the shelter's limited resources. One afternoon, Victoria met a young boy named Marcus, no older than 10, who reminded her of herself at that age. Marcus had been staying at the shelter with his mother after losing their home. He clutched a tattered backpack and wore an expression that was far too serious for a child. When she asked about the bear, Marcus said he'd seen it but hadn't taken it because it looked like someone else's favorite thing. His innocence and selflessness stayed with Victoria. That evening, as she reflected on her encounters, a strange thought occurred to her. She had spent years climbing the ladder of success, believing wealth and power would shield her from pain. But here, among people who had so little, she was starting to feel something she hadn't felt in years: connection. Victoria finally tracked down Helen Murphy. The elderly woman lived in a quiet retirement community on the outskirts of the city. Nervous but resolute, Victoria arranged to meet her. When she arrived, Helen greeted her warmly, though it took a moment for recognition to dawn. "Victoria Hale," Helen said with a smile. "It's been decades. You've grown into quite the accomplished woman." After exchanging pleasantries, Victoria brought up the teddy bear. Helen's eyes softened as she recalled the past. "Oh, Buttons," Helen murmured, her voice tinged with nostalgia. "Your mother gave it to me when you moved. She didn't have the heart to tell you, but she sold most of your things to pay the bills. She knew how much that bear meant to you, so she asked me to keep it safe. I didn't realize how much time had passed until I found it in a box a few months ago. I thought donating it might give it a second life." The revelation hit Victoria like a wave. Her mother, who she had resented for years for their difficult childhood, had made sacrifices she had never understood. For the first time, Victoria saw her mother not as a struggling woman, but as someone who had done everything she could to protect her child. Shaken but grateful, Victoria thanked Helen and returned to her penthouse. That night she sat alone with Buttons, memories of her mother swirling in her mind. She remembered the nights her mother worked long shifts to make sure there was food on the table, and the mornings she woke up to handwritten notes of encouragement on the kitchen counter. Somehow, Victoria had allowed herself to forget the love her mother had poured into their lives, even when money was tight. The next day, Victoria went back to the shelter with a new sense of purpose. She offered to sponsor several programs for children, inspired by what Marcus had said about the bear. She also started spending more time with Carla, asking questions about the people who relied on the shelter. Slowly, her hardened exterior began to soften as she became invested in the lives of those she once saw as distant strangers. Carla, in turn, began to see Victoria in a different light. The woman who had initially seemed cold and detached now listened intently to stories of hardship and resilience. It was clear Victoria was changing, though neither of them fully realized how deeply this journey would alter the course of her life. One morning during her regular visit to the shelter, Victoria noticed a group of children playing in the corner. Among them was Marcus, laughing as he showed the others a chess set he had found in the donations. Watching him, she was struck by how a simple object could bring so much joy. It reminded her of the warmth and laughter she had once shared with her own family, moments that had seemed so ordinary then, but now felt priceless. As Victoria helped Carla sort through a pile of new donations, Carla casually mentioned that they were hosting an upcoming fundraiser to help with renovations. Victoria immediately offered to sponsor the event, surprising even herself with the eagerness in her voice. She realized that this was no longer about obligation or appearances. She genuinely wanted to help. The fundraiser came together quickly, thanks to Victoria's connections and resources. The night of the event, the shelter was transformed into a vibrant space filled with supporters, volunteers, and families. As Victoria watched the room come alive, she felt a sense of fulfillment she hadn't experienced in years. But the evening took an unexpected turn when Carla introduced her to a man who claimed to know something about her mother. The man, an older gentleman named Mr. Sanders, had been a close friend of Victoria's mother during her most challenging years. He revealed that her mother had volunteered at a similar shelter decades ago, often bringing food and small toys she could spare. "She had such a big heart," Mr. Sanders said, his voice thick with emotion. "Even when she didn't have much, she always found a way to give." The revelation floored Victoria. She had spent her entire life believing her mother had only been focused on survival, yet here was proof of her selflessness and generosity. It was a stark reminder of how little she truly understood about her past. Later that night, as Victoria sat quietly in the shelter's kitchen, Carla joined her. Carla shared her own struggles as a widow raising two daughters, drawing unexpected parallels between their lives. The conversation turned deeply personal, with Victoria admitting her regret over the years she had spent pushing people away. Carla's simple words stayed with her. "It's never too late to let people in." As Victoria left the shelter that night, a sense of clarity began to take shape. She knew what she needed to do, not just for the shelter, but for herself. A week later, Victoria returned to the shelter with a bold announcement. She wanted to fund a complete renovation of the building and establish a long-term program for struggling families. Her decision was met with cheers from the staff and volunteers, but Carla looked at her with quiet concern. "Are you sure about this?" Carla asked later in private. "This is a huge commitment, and I want to make sure it's coming from the right place." Victoria nodded, her voice steady. "This isn't just about the shelter. It's about honoring the sacrifices my mother made and making sure her legacy of giving lives on." For the first time, she felt like she was channeling her wealth into something meaningful, something that went beyond numbers and influence. As work on the shelter's transformation began, Victoria found herself spending even more time there. She bonded with Marcus and the other children, helping them with their homework and teaching them chess. Slowly but surely, her once empty schedule filled with purpose. One day, Marcus handed her a crumpled drawing of the shelter, with himself, Carla, and Victoria all smiling together. "You're like family now," he said shyly, leaving Victoria speechless. The turning point came when Victoria decided to visit her mother's grave, a place she hadn't been in years. She brought Buttons with her, the teddy bear that had sparked this entire journey. As she stood in front of the simple headstone, memories of her mother came rushing back, the way she used to hum lullabies, her reassuring smile despite their hardships, and the unspoken love that had shaped Victoria's childhood. "I didn't understand back then," Victoria whispered, her voice cracking. "But I do now. You gave everything to make sure I had a chance. And now it's my turn to give." Placing buttons gently at the base of the grave, she promised to honor her mother's spirit by helping others as she once did. When Victoria returned to the shelter that evening, she was greeted with a surprise. Carla and the staff had organized a small gathering to celebrate her contributions. Marcus presented her with a plaque that read, "In gratitude to Victoria Hale, a true force for good." Overwhelmed, Victoria realized that she had found something money couldn't buy: a sense of belonging and the joy of making a difference. The renovations at the shelter moved swiftly, transforming the once crumbling building into a vibrant, welcoming space. Freshly painted walls, a playground for the children, and a new library stocked with books and toys became a testament to the generosity that Victoria had poured into the project. Yet it wasn't just the physical changes that marked the transformation, it was the sense of hope and renewal among the people who relied on the shelter. Victoria's involvement deepened as she launched an initiative to provide job training programs for parents at the shelter, giving them tools to rebuild their lives. She also formed a mentorship program for children, enlisting volunteers from her company to help. Marcus, once shy and withdrawn, flourished under the new opportunities, and his mother began attending classes to earn her certification as a nurse. Carla often teased Victoria about how much time she spent at the shelter. "You know, you're here more than I am," Carla joked one evening. But Victoria didn't mind. For the first time in her life, she felt truly fulfilled. Her days filled with purpose and connection. The cold corporate walls of her office seemed like a distant memory compared to the warmth and laughter she now experienced daily. As the grand reopening of the shelter approached, Victoria reflected on how far she had come. The person who once valued only wealth and power now found joy in the small, meaningful moments, like reading stories to the children or watching Marcus beat her at chess. The event itself was a community celebration, with music, food, and speeches from the people whose lives had been transformed. Carla gave a heartfelt address, thanking Victoria for not just her financial contributions, but for becoming part of their family. "This shelter isn't just a building," Carla said. "It's a home. And Victoria, you've helped us bring that to life." When it was Victoria's turn to speak, she stood before the crowd, humbled by the journey that had brought her there. She spoke about her mother, the lessons she had learned from her, and how rediscovering buttons had changed her perspective. "Sometimes, the smallest things, like a teddy bear, can remind us of what really matters," she said, her voice full of emotion. The crowd erupted in applause, but for Victoria, the real reward was the smiles on the faces of the children who would benefit from this new chapter. The weeks following the grand reopening felt like a new beginning, not just for the shelter, but for Victoria as well. She continued to work closely with Carla and the team, but she also started to reevaluate other aspects of her life. Her high-rise penthouse, once a symbol of success, now felt hollow compared to the lively, welcoming atmosphere of the shelter. Victoria decided to make changes. She began selling off some of her luxury possessions, donating the proceeds to expand the shelter's programs. Her company, once laser-focused on profit, also started shifting its priorities, dedicating a significant portion of its resources to philanthropic initiatives. Her colleagues, inspired by her transformation, rallied behind the cause, and soon, the ripple effect of her generosity began to spread beyond the shelter. But perhaps the most profound change came in her personal life. Victoria sought out relationships she had neglected, reaching out to old friends and even distant relatives. With every reconnection, she found a piece of herself she had lost along the way. Her journey of giving back wasn't just about helping others, it was about healing the parts of herself she had ignored for so long. One evening, after a long day at the shelter, Victoria sat with Carla and Marcus in the quiet of the common room. Marcus, now brimming with confidence, was excitedly explaining his dream of becoming an architect one day. "I want to build places like this," he said, gesturing around the room. His words filled Victoria with pride, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine what her future might look like, not as a solitary businesswoman, but as part of a larger community. As the night went on, Carla opened up about how much Victoria's efforts had inspired her. "You didn't just rebuild this shelter," Carla said softly. "You reminded all of us what it means to care, to believe in each other again." Victoria felt a deep sense of gratitude. The shelter had given her far more than she had ever expected. It had brought her back to life. And though the road had been filled with challenges, she knew her journey wasn't over. There were still more lives to touch, more connections to make, and more love to give. As she looked around the room, she realized she had found something she never thought she'd have again: a family. Months passed, and the changes Victoria had set into motion continued to grow. The shelter had become more than a safe haven. It was now a community hub. Families came together for workshops, children thrived in after-school programs, and graduates of the shelter's job training initiatives often returned to mentor others. The spirit of giving and growth that Victoria had ignited spread like wildfire. Victoria herself had changed in ways she never imagined. She moved out of her sprawling penthouse and into a modest but cozy home closer to the shelter. The space felt more like her mother's old apartment, warm, welcoming, and filled with memories. On her desk sat Marcus's drawing, framed as a reminder of the new chapter she had embraced. One evening, Victoria found herself walking through the shelter's halls, now buzzing with life. She paused to watch Marcus and the other children working on an art project in the library. Their laughter echoed through the space, filling her heart with a sense of peace. "This is what my mother would have wanted," she thought to herself, tears welling in her eyes. For the first time in years, she felt truly at home. As the shelter flourished, Victoria began to focus on long-term plans to ensure its future. She established a foundation in her mother's name, dedicated to helping families in need across the city. Through her connections, she secured partnerships with local businesses and organizations, creating a network of support that would sustain the shelter's mission for years to come. Carla became the director of the foundation, a role she took on with pride and passion. Together, she and Victoria worked tirelessly to expand their impact, and soon, shelters modeled after theirs began popping up in nearby neighborhoods. Marcus, now thriving in school, often talked about how he wanted to design one of these buildings when he grew up. His dreams became a symbol of the hope and potential that the shelter had inspired. On the anniversary of the shelter's reopening, Victoria organized a celebration to reflect on all they had accomplished. Surrounded by the people she had come to consider family, she gave a speech that summed up her journey. "This shelter isn't just a place, it's a promise that no one will ever feel forgotten, and that we'll always have each other to lean on." The crowd erupted in applause, but for Victoria, the real reward was seeing the smiles around her. The final moment of closure came when Marcus, now an ambitious young man, stood beside her at the ribbon-cutting ceremony for a new shelter, this time one designed entirely by him. He had kept his promise to pursue architecture, and his designs reflected the same warmth and community spirit Victoria had instilled in the organization. As the ribbon was cut and the crowd cheered, Victoria stood by his side, her heart swelling with pride. The work was far from over, but in that moment, she realized the impact she had made. Not just with the shelter or the foundation, but with the people whose lives she had touched. People who had helped her rediscover the power of love, community, and giving. As the day drew to a close, Victoria stood outside the new shelter looking at the sun setting over the city. The journey had been long and full of unexpected turns, but every moment had led her here, to a place where she felt whole, where she finally understood the importance of those simple things that once seemed insignificant, and as she took a deep breath, She knew one thing for certain. She was home.